FDR's Washington. All in the weeks ahead on C-SPAN's Book Notes.
In June 1967, 34 American servicemen were killed in an Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, an intelligence-gathering warship in the Mediterranean Sea. Journalist Alison Weir has interviewed survivors and their relatives, former naval officials, and others concerning the incident, which was classified an Israeli mistake. She discussed her findings Wednesday at a forum hosted by the Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine. It's just over an hour.
The story of the USS Liberty is familiar to most of you. On June 8, 1967, the USS Liberty limped into the port of Malta with more than 3,000 holes from armor-piercing bullets and over 800 rockets and missile cavities. 34 Americans were killed and 171 were injured on the attack of the U.S. warship. But for decades, the details surrounding the assault remained a well-guarded military secret. Officially, the entire case is still classified as an Israeli mistake. What really happened? Why were the Liberty's distress calls ignored? Why has Congress tabled hearings on the matter? Alison Weir, a journalist and freelance reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, has interviewed survivors and relatives, former naval and government officials, and others concerning the events of that day. She will share with us their views and desire for justice. Alison Weir is the founder of If Americans Knew, an organization dedicated to providing Americans with information on topics of importance that are misreported or underreported in the American media. She has been a journalist for many years and was associated with the Center for Investigative Reporting. Ms. Weir spent time traveling through the hotspots of Gaza and the West Bank on her own independent investigation. In May of this year, she received the Truth and Justice Award from the American Muslims for Jerusalem. Ms. Weir has spoken to many organizations and audiences, including Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Northwestern University, the University of California at Berkeley, Stanford University, and most recently, Columbia University, where she was last evening. Her present tour is sponsored by the American Legion. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Alison Weir.
Thank you. I am extremely honored to be here, and especially speaking in front of such a distinguished group of people. Thank you so much for being here and for giving me this opportunity to talk about a subject of such extreme importance to all of us. As was mentioned, last night I was speaking at Columbia University. I've spoken at about 7 places in the last week throughout Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and New York. And it's been very interesting to see an American public that is becoming aroused about what is being done with their tax money in the Middle East. It is quite heartening to do this, although sometimes difficult. Last night, in fact, when I spoke at Columbia, I was quite unexpectedly slightly picketed. This is a first experience for me, by people outside my talk passing out flyers suggesting that this discussion should not occur on the Columbia campus, and passing out writings purported to be by me. Now, some of these were by me, and so I was really quite happy that they were helping me disseminate this information. But some of them were not. And in fact, they were writings I had not even seen before. I'm not sure I would have a problem with them. I looked at them quickly, but they were not by me. So it is somewhat disturbing to have that sort of thing going on. I do hope that they'll get copies of this talk and that it will be coherent and that they will then pass this out as well. My journey to you today has been an odd one, somewhat winding, completely to me a few years ago, unexpected. 2 years ago, I was the editor of the Sausalito newspaper, writing about the city council, kindergartners, fishermen, firemen, and harbor masters, foreign policy, the Middle East, and extraordinary and tragic peacetime casualties to our armed forces were not my beat. But then, as I described in my last talk here about a year ago, I believe, approximately 22 months ago now, I began to grow curious about what was going on in the Middle East when the current Palestinian uprising began. What was this all about, I wondered? Why were young, unarmed people hurling stones with such desperation and what seemed to me extremely dangerous abandon at literally tanks? As I attempted to answer this question, I found myself becoming more and more immersed in a subject that I have found since to be increasingly and profoundly disturbing on every possible level. I found, as many of you did long ago, but I found 2 years ago, a core injustice in which a colonial preferential supremacist national system was imposed in 1948 on a land that had previously been multicultural. I found an entire indigenous population that had been decimated and was currently being decimated still further, displaced, dispossessed, almost destroyed. I found a continuing attempt at an activity that I feel, describe by its accurate name, genocide. I found an entire group of people who the displacing group had attempted for many years not only to expel, but also, and in some ways this is even more horrifying, to completely erase from history. I found that one of the first acts of the new discriminatory state, which named itself Israel, was to destroy entire towns and villages, over 400 of them, and then to compound this horror, to rename every remaining town, landform, brook, and hillock with a new Hebrew name. This was new to me, and this is, I'm finding, widely unknown to most American citizens. I found that the very word Palestinian was not to be used, that the very existence of a Palestinian population was to be denied by this new entity. As Golda Meir exemplified so infamously, there was, quote, no such thing as a Palestinian. And I found that this bizarre and horrifying denial of an entire culture and population was to continue through to today. I heard such an extraordinary denialism, in fact, not long ago in Tiburon, California. And I have been seeing it recently in a thoroughly fraudulent book, a volume filled with mendacity and scurrilous pseudo-scholarship that is even now being sold by, I hope, unknowing booksellers, and is being purchased, I greatly fear, by an increasingly manipulated American public. Over a year ago now, I traveled to the Palestinian territories to see for myself if what I was learning could possibly be true. If our news reports could be as incomplete and inverted as I was now beginning to believe that they were, as I compared their content with the coverage being provided citizens of other countries throughout the rest of the world. Coverage of violence in which Israeli forces, I discovered as I researched this, killed over 140 Palestinians before the first Jewish citizen in Israel was lost during this current intifada, in which over 80 Palestinian children were killed, quite often by gunfire to the head, as the reports so chillingly describe, before the first Israeli child was also tragically killed. A violence in which, incredibly, the continuing brutality by this initiator was and is consistently and inexplicably referred to in our press as retaliation. I went to see for myself, and I did. And what I saw during my month of random and independent wandering throughout the West Bank and Gaza is what will prevent me from ever ending my attempt to tell Americans the truth of this issue. I saw tragedy and devastation far beyond what was being reported in our media. I saw what a child looks like who has experienced gunfire to the head. I saw what a war zone looks like when one side has almost no weapons, and when the other side has the best, most efficiently deadly weaponry that limitless money can buy, my money and yours. I saw the vast quantum disparity in power and the ruthless use of such power to kill, subjugate, and maim at will that has led to that most tragic of phenomena, the suicide bomber. When I returned to the U.S. about a little over a year ago, I began even more to investigate the American policies that were enabling and perpetuating such horrors. Policies that, it seemed to me, are not just immoral and deeply inhumane, but that are, without doubt, extremely, I fear, potentially disastrously detrimental to the well-being of Americans as well. I read and continued to read numerous books that would inform me on this subject. Books by Stephen Green, Donald Neff, Kathleen Christensen, William Kilgore, and others, authors I fervently recommend on this subject. And I found that U.S. policies were specifically not being promoted to benefit American citizens or U.S. interests. This was quite a shock. I found that they were being promoted by our elected officials for one very clear reason, and one reason almost exclusively, and that was to ensure that these officials be re-elected. I learned that our experts in the military and in the State Department have, from the very beginning, quite often advocated policies diametrically opposite to the vast support of Israel that our Congress has so consistently and so dangerously enacted by overruling the advice these sectors have attempted to give them. I learned that our, quote, special relationship with Israel is indeed quite special in the uniqueness that this word implies. That this relationship is one in which the United States is steadily insulted, endangered, and damaged. I learned that in this relationship, Israel has tortured, with impunity, American citizens. A long-standing accusation that has horribly and in great detail been thoroughly substantiated in a recent issue of the Foreign Service Journal. Perhaps most shocking of all, however, was the revelation that I am specifically here to discuss today. The unprovoked and merciless attack by Israeli air and sea forces on a U.S. Navy vessel operating in international waters, in which there were over 200 American casualties, 34 killed and 172 injured, some quite horribly mangled. I, like the vast majority of American citizens, had never heard of this atrocity before. In our multitude of daily reports, news broadcasts, magazine articles, editorials, and analyses on the Middle East, mention of this extraordinary example of American loss is almost unanimously omitted. But in my searches, I have come across an abundance of detailed and excellent information on this event. There was, to begin with, the book The Assault on the Liberty by Commander James Ennis, the second in command on board the USS Liberty, whose 1980 expose began the unraveling of the enormous cover-up of this incident. The award-winning website ussliberty.org, replete with photographs, reports, and first-hand accounts by Liberty survivors. A documentary finally aired last summer on the History Channel after several postponements. A talk by a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, James Akins, that is reprinted in an excellent pamphlet by this organization, the Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine, and that is, I trust, in the lobby right now. Copies of which my organization, If Americans Knew, have been disseminating for the past year. There also is a riveting chapter in James Bamford's most recent book, Body of Secrets, in which additional information from the National Security Agency was revealed and is revealed. And most recently, the comprehensive and powerful new documentary just released by longtime filmmaker Tito Howard, entitled Loss of Liberty, a sadly apt title as days go on, in which several Medal of Honor winners and a number of extremely high-ranking American military officers, including Admiral Weir, the former chairman of the Chiefs of Staff and one of the few admirals ever to have been in charge of both the Pacific and Atlantic fleets, in which these heroes call on Congress to hold hearings on this greatest peacetime destruction to a U.S. Navy ship. Congress's refusal so far to investigate this event, by the way, as I understand it, is an unparalleled and unique omission in its constitutional responsibility for oversight of military affairs. It has held hearings on every other such peacetime attack on an American ship, I believe, one substantially smaller than this one. By the way, I'm speaking, I was contacted about this speech after I had already left my home, so I didn't have access to all of my notes. So certainly, if I am making any mistakes, I would welcome people to correct me. I became enormously and almost obsessively interested in this event as I was learning all of these shocking details. I had grown up in a military family. My father had gone to West Point, and when he was back there serving as a tactical officer after serving in the Pacific in World War II, I was born there at West Point. I had uncles in the Air Force like my father, as well as in the Army and in the Navy. As a child, I had lived in Newport, where my father attended the Navy War College. I could not believe that a peacetime attack on the U.S. military by a supposed ally, an ally that we have continued funding and providing weaponry to on a scale unapproached by any other recipient. An attack that resulted in over 200 casualties, not to mention the huge loss of valuable equipment, could go so unnoticed. Could Israel be that powerful? Our Congress that cowed? Our leaders that negligent? Our citizens that under and misinformed? I suspect that many of you know the sad three-letter answer to my questions. As I was learning more and more about what had happened to the USS Liberty, fate suddenly presented me with an opportunity to hear about it firsthand. A friend of mine was working at the Veterans Hospital in the San Francisco area when he passed a man in the hall wearing a hat emblazoned USS Liberty. My friend almost grabbed this man. He also had learned recently about this issue and was as shocked by it as I was. And he said hello to this man and asked him if he had been on board the ship when it had been attacked. The man looked equally shocked and said in astonishment, "You know about it?" I called this man Terry Halbadier. He lived in Eureka, California, north of me, and I arranged to drive up the approximately 8 hours to Eureka to interview him. And he told me what had happened. The following account, many of you will know, but perhaps some of you this will be new to, is taken from my conversations with this man. These conversations span 2 days, and from the diverse and extensive reports by the others I have cited above, particularly of Ambassador Akins, and of other conversations I've had with the sister of someone who did not survive the attack, and by Tito Howard, who has made the excellent new film on this subject. On June 8, 1967, the USS Liberty, an electronics intelligence ship, was in the Mediterranean off the coast of Gaza in international waters. It was 13 miles offshore. As you may recall, this was a few days after Israel had begun what is now known as the Six-Day War. Israel had attacked Egypt on June 5th, destroying most of its air force on the ground. I believe 300 planes were destroyed before they had moved 1 inch. And the Liberty, the USS Liberty, was there to pick up all transmissions. It was what is known commonly as a spy ship. Beginning at 9 a.m. that morning, June 8th, there were a series of flybys by Israeli aircraft, flying as low as 200 feet and circling the ship, which, being an intelligence ship, was only very, very lightly armed. There had earlier been discussion of removing the ship from the area now that it was a war zone, because it was so vulnerable to attack. It was so defenseless. Or there had been talk of sending a destroyer to protect it. But the request for such an escort was denied because, as Admiral Martin replied at the time, quote, "Liberty is a clearly marked United States ship in international waters, not a participant in the conflict, and not a reasonable subject for attack by any nation." As these planes flew over the USS Liberty that morning on June 8th, they could see the planes, of course, quite clearly. They were so low, and in fact could see the pilots' faces. They waved to them. This was the man that I interviewed, Badier, mentioned this was his day off. He was lying out to get some suntan, and they were not disturbed by these flyovers. The first plane, they couldn't quite tell who it was, the second, but eventually they could see one where the Israeli markings were easily visible. But then, this was in the morning, then at 2 p.m., there were more flyovers. These were by 2 Mirage aircraft, which suddenly approached the ship. Since the Arabs, the Egyptians, did not have Mirages, and our ally, Israel, did, the crew was not worried. But of course, they should have been. The aircraft let loose an extremely destructive 5-minute vicious attack on the ship, and the damage was extensive. A few minutes later, more planes arrived, continuing the attack on this mostly defenseless ship. And then there were still more. In all, the attack lasted 22 minutes. 9 men had been killed, and about 60 were wounded. Badier described to me what it was like to be on board in the middle of such a maelstrom. He was an ET, an electronics technician, I believe that stands for. And his particular job, in fact, turns out to have been the one to maintain the antennae that were so crucial for this ship, which was to pick up transmissions and to relay them pretty much undigested back here to Washington. His job had been to maintain those antennae, as I described. But, being an American sailor, he was aware that one of the antennae was not transmitting properly. But there were 7, and he thought that was probably enough, and he was off duty. So when he went on duty again, he planned to repair that 8th antenna. He had the parts that were necessary for it, but he just hadn't gotten to it yet. So when this attack began, he made it to the bridge. I'm trying to remember exactly how, but he was at the bridge, and they were attacking the ship. they looked around, he described, at these antennae, you know, as they tried to send out a mayday, and they saw that they sort of looked at the bow and aft, and all of the transmitting antennae had been taken out on the first flyby. As he described it, there were certain frequencies that they were transmitting on, and the Israelis quite clearly knew those frequencies, and their weaponry could hone in, therefore, on those antennas. However, one antenna, the broken one, was not transmitting, and therefore it was not taken out. They noticed that one was still there. Halbadier knew why it had not been taken out, and he and another one of the sailors realized that they needed to get it working so they could send out a mayday. So as this man Terry described, his friend was standing there, and they said, okay, you go out and connect it together, and I'll plug this in, or whatever it was. You know, that was basically the way he described it to me. And then they just said, no, actually, why don't you do it? And they changed places. And at that minute, his colleague was killed. It was that quick. That's how quick it is in warfare, I suppose. So Halbadier at that point went out and connected it up and got it working again. And when I said to him, that sounds like an extremely courageous, heroic action. You know, weren't you terrified to do such a thing? And being a West Texas boy, he said, well, you know, it's not the sort of thing I would do. You know, I know a lot better than that. But somebody in my uniform, who apparently looked like me, went out and did that. So because that was connected up, they did quickly get through a mayday. And that mayday is why we don't now all read in our history books, and I'm sure it would be in there to great detail, and why we don't see referenced in our many news analyses on the Middle East about this U.S. Navy ship destroyed by Egypt in 1967. That's what it was going to be pinned on. But it could not be, because the ship did not sink and refused to sink. The distress call was received by the aircraft carrier Saratoga, which then immediately launched 12 F-4 Phantom jets and 4 tanker planes. Help was on the way. Then comes the next outrage that many of you know about, but I was shocked to learn, which was that the White House recalled these aircraft, these rescuing aircraft. Secretary of Defense McNamara personally got on the radio circuit and recalled them. President Johnson apparently did not want our ally embarrassed. The attack continued. Torpedo boats next arrived on the scene, launching 3 torpedoes at the already severely disabled ship. A huge hole was ripped in the side, but because of a miracle of fate, this had hit where the ship's hull was reinforced, and the ship, surprisingly but thankfully, was not sliced in two as it otherwise would have been. By the way, if it had been sliced in two, as I said, this would have been something we would know nothing about, and that does make one wonder how many of our current assumptions are as equally false as that one would have been. Most of the lifeboats had been destroyed in the first attack, but the crew managed to launch 3. The Israelis then destroyed 2 of these, a war crime, by the way, and captured the 3rd. Now, even if, as Israel tried to claim, somewhat ludicrously, I have to say afterwards, that they thought that this was an Egyptian ship half the size of the USS Liberty, if they thought that this was an Egyptian ship, it still would have been a war crime to destroy lifeboats. It was quite clear to the sailors on board that the Israelis were intent on leaving no survivors. When the boat quite miraculously and through incredibly heroic actions by its crew, and in particular by its commander, William McGonigal, who received the Medal of Honor for his actions, when this ship refused to sink, the 3rd phase of the Israeli onslaught began. Helicopters came overhead, Halbadier described to me, and he described seeing men in combat gear and guns getting ready to board the ship. He said they were going to board us and scuttle the ship. That was quite clear to him. But he then said suddenly, and again, there are so many miracles with this particular incident, but not enough, but at least there are some. Suddenly the helicopters turned and flew away. It was at this time, it is conjectured by Halbadier and by others, that Israel became aware that its identity was known and that Egypt would not be blamed. After 2 hours of an extremely savage attack, Israel now said, in effect, "Oh dear, we've made a mistake. Let us help you." Captain McGonigal, with dead men all around him, severely wounded himself, the decks running with blood, declined their offer. He brought the ship back to Malta, it limped back, where 821 rocket and missile holes and more than 3,000 holes from armor-piercing bullets were counted. Why did Israel attack? The only ones who know for sure, of course, are those who gave the orders. But there are several compelling answers to this question that have been put forward. One was by, let me get my notes here, by the Undersecretary of State at that time, who had, under Johnson, James Ball, if I remember, George Ball, I knew it was George Ball. He concluded, let me see, this is, what he described was that basically, it was, of course, the main reason to attack it, of course, was to prevent their allies, the Americans, from knowing what Israel was doing there. The first idea had been to not even admit that Israel had attacked first. This was also going to be blamed on Nasser, but it was known that Israel did attack first, although surprisingly many people to this day will actually say the opposite. But it was especially to block transmission about information about Israel, what Israel was going to do next. And let me see if I can find, okay, here it is, in an excellent book called The Passionate Attachment, America's Involvement with Israel. George Ball wrote what he believed, quote, "The Liberty's presence and function were known to Israel's leaders. They presumably thought it vital that the Liberty be prevented from informing Washington of their intention to violate any ceasefire before they had completed their occupation of the Golan. Their solution was brutal and direct. They did not want us to know about their intentions to invade Syria." Since then, more has come to light, especially in a book by James Bamford, a very long chapter in which he gives information that I don't think was known to Mr. Akins at the time of his talk, but that at the same time that all of this was going on, Israeli forces in the Sinai were murdering prisoners of war. That this was going on not very far away from where the USS Liberty was stationed. And his conjecture is that it was to cover up these atrocities as well. That was part of the aim of Israel in preventing the USS Liberty from being able to complete its mission of getting this information back to the United States. And it was with that intention also that it was planning and hoping to sink this ship. Not too long ago, I had an opportunity to talk with Benny Morris, who's the very well-known Israeli historian. He's called one of the new historians, whose books have done a very good job of presenting some of the declassified Israeli archival material about the history of Israel, and provoked quite a controversy in Israel when it turned out that many of the myths about the origins of Israel and about the 1948 war were not as Israel had said, but were very much what the Arab historians had been writing all along. For example, that the people of Palestine, this 750 to 800,000 people who had fled their homes under extreme distress, as one Red Cross worker described, no one will know how many children died during that event. That they did not do this voluntarily, as, again, amazingly, Israel was trying to tell the world, and perhaps even more amazingly, many Americans seemed gullible enough to believe. And I was probably one of them, I have to say. when I've looked back at how little I knew about this issue. Anyway, in my conversation with Mr. Morris, who, as I said, did a very good job on when he found documentation that refuted the Israeli myths on this subject, he did include this and wrote several books about this documentation. However, he is, of course, and quite loyal to Israel, including its incarnation as a state in which certain people are treated with preference to other people based on their religion and ethnicity. And after he spoke at the University of California at Berkeley, I spoke with him for probably about 30 minutes. And I asked him in particular, I asked him about the USS Liberty and inquired as to why I hadn't seen any reference to this incident in any of his books. And he told me, well, I talked to someone who was very high up in the Israeli government, and they assured me that this was an accident. Now, again, many of you, and I know, that Israel was trying to make this excuse once they discovered that this incident had been discovered and that their identity was known. They had been trying to make this excuse from the start. It holds no water whatsoever, and that was known from the beginning. Let me see if I have some of my notes that talk about that. For example, this was by Dwight Porter, who was the United States ambassador to Lebanon at the time of the Israeli attack, and who told columnist Roland Evans in late 1991 that the CIA station chief showed him during or immediately after the attack on the Liberty the transcript of the intercepted Israeli messages. The U.S. had a number of different vessels intercepting messages, including surveillance aircraft flying high overhead the Israeli aircraft. Israeli planes, these messages revealed that were intercepted by the United States government, had been given the order by the IDF to attack the Liberty. But a pilot on one of the Mirages that was attacking the USS Liberty replied that it was an American ship. The order, however, was repeated, but the pilot still insisted that he could see the American flag, which was flying throughout this attack. There was first a huge flag, that one was shot down, and then another flag had been hoisted. He was then told harshly that he had his orders, attack it. So again, when I talked to Mr. Morris about this more, about the fact that there was a great deal of evidence, documentary evidence, that this was not a mistake, he then said, well, but let's think, what could have been in the mind of the Israeli pilots? And at that point, I said to him, I was shocked, because I said to him, as a historian, you mean you are placing some conjecture about someone's state of mind over documents that prove that exist historically. And at that point, he walked off, and that ended our conversation. To bring this up a little bit more to the present, because I think my time is nearing the end, it is quite exciting to see that there is an enormous effort being made now, and has been all along, but I think sometimes we find that the time is right, as the Bible has said, there is a season for everything, and that I think this season has come. With the amount of information that's increasingly getting out, the fact that there now exists a communication vehicle, the internet, that did not exist before, means that Americans are learning many facts that they have not known before. Often these facts have been known to the rest of the world, but Americans have not known them. But now they have access to that information, and they are learning them. And with these additional documentaries that have come out, including the most recent one, there is now evidence, clear, vivid evidence of what went on with the USS Liberty. And an effort is being made to call on congressional hearings into this incident. This is not a radical proposition. This is not saying what the conclusion should be, although the evidence probably shows that. It is the American way. It is saying this kind of incident This is the constitutional responsibility of Congress to oversee. It is their responsibility to hold hearings and to investigate this incident. And now, with the release of the attack on Liberty, I think if I'm getting the name again right, a number of American Legion posts around the country have passed strong resolutions calling on Congress to do just that. The Washington, D.C. chapter passed this. Perhaps somebody is here from that chapter and could come and speak up afterwards if there are questions. And most recently, I believe it was in Minnesota that American members of the American Legion passed resolutions to call on Congress to investigate and to hold hearings on this incident. I personally, in the San Francisco area, recently joined the Ladies Auxiliary to the American Legion. And when I went to that meeting, the ladies there were quite interested to hear about this attack on an American naval ship. One of them had completely shocked and had never heard of this incident before. There was, I neglected to mention this earlier, but the implication has been there anyway. There was, as you all know, an enormous cover-up of this incident. Admiral Isaac Kidd came on board the ship and told the sailors not to breathe a word of this to anyone, not to tell their families or relatives or even to talk among themselves. This, of course, again, was an enormously traumatic experience for these young sailors. They were, of course, many of them were 18, 19, 20. They had not just had a vicious, very bloody attack in which many of their crewmates had been killed and enormous numbers had been severely injured. Now they were being told that their government would throw them in the brig and throw the key away if they mentioned this to anyone. This is what went on and stayed in effect until finally the word started to get out, beginning, I believe, probably beginning with Ennis's book, which was taken around and distributed to libraries, but sadly has often been removed from those libraries. I think that this cover-up is going to unravel. I feel strongly as a journalist, my perspective is that the citizens of all countries, of democracies, must be accurately informed. We are citizens, all of us as Americans, are citizens of the most powerful country on earth. It is essential. We are the top rung of government. We are, in the end, somebody asked me last night about if I had talked with anyone from the highest levels of government, and I reminded them that we are the highest level of government. I believe fervently that Americans need to be accurately informed, and once informed, that they will do the right thing. Thank you for my opportunity to try to contribute to that. If there are any questions, I would like to invite Mr. Howard, I believe sitting in the back row, I've never met before, but perhaps he could come up and also answer questions. He worked for his documentary, I believe, on 20 years or so, and has extensive knowledge.
People to believe it takes you 20 years to do a documentary. But this one took actually 25 years. I was burdened with knowing that the attack on the Liberty was deliberate because I was told that by Admiral Tom Moore and in 75, 8 months after he had stepped down from being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it's an incredible story, but I think what's important here, and it's beautifully delivered, and most of the facts were right. Actually, the Liberty was 5 times the size of the El Qasir and looked absolutely nothing like the Egyptian ship. I do want to add one thing that I think just adds more weight to the argument, and that is that if we ever do get a hearing on the Liberty, it would be good for responsible Israelis to answer, if you want we Americans to believe your story that this was a case of mistaken identity, then why in the world did the attacking Mirage and Super Mysteers jam all 5 American emergency radio channels? And how'd they know what they were? This is the one story, and I believe this for a long, long time, that can really shock Americans from being so complacent on the Middle East and accepting the gurus of television for the facts. I mean, it's getting ludicrous to the point that our president calls Sharon a man of peace. Did you know there's going to be a lawsuit about that? Sharon is going to sue George Bush for calling him a man of peace because it cost him 12 points in the polls. That'd make a good cartoon somewhere. But the important message here, I think, is that the American Arab and Muslim communities have been very hesitant to stand up, to be involved, that they don't want to show themselves to be less American than others. But those of you who have not really taken an active part, this is the time. This is a climate and an environment where Americans are furious about the deliberate killing of Americans. And we make a very compelling case that this was premeditated and it was deliberate. And I got some evidence, this is an ongoing thing, just 2 days ago, and I believe it, I'm gonna follow it up, that Washington, the president, the White House, and the Pentagon knew that the Liberty was under attack before the Sixth Fleet did. Amazing new development. And, but you have to remember some of the basic facts too, that if you don't mind just throwing a few. The chief of staff in the White House in 1967 was Walter Rostow, and in the State Department, sorry, Mr. Byrd, but there was a Eugene Rostow, and he was the Deputy Secretary of State for Political Affairs, and at that time in charge of the Middle East desk. Now, at the UN, we had Arthur Goldberg, and I'm getting a copy of a radio broadcast of his 2 days after the attack on the Liberty. It behooves everybody here who knows and cares to reach out to Americans, and I think our film arms you with a lot of facts. Those of you who have seen it have been very responsive to me, and it's a weapon. The Liberty guys I talked to, Terry Halbardier had been lost to his shipmates, and it took me 8 months to find him, and he's terrific in the film. This guy was so brave. The Israelis used heat-seeking missiles. There were 8 40-foot whip antennas. No, 8 40-foot whip antennas, 4 down each side of the ship. The connected ones generated heat at their base. They were knocked out with heat-seeking missiles, and the 8th one that Halbardier connected to the radio transmitter is eventually what saved them. The other thing is that when the Israelis fired all 6 of their torpedoes, and they missed, McGonigal was incredible because they really pounded the bridge. Jim Ennis, who was not the second in command, he was second in command would have to be Executive Officer Armstrong, Philip Armstrong. He was a lieutenant. And another hero was the guy down in the engine room, George Golden. Imagine a limited amount of power from the boilers, and he had to make the decision of how much to give to get power to get underway and get out of there, and how much to be able to give pressure to the hoses, to the firefighters who are trying to put out this incredible amount of damage on this ship. If Americans know the truth on Liberty, it will immediately, in my view, relieve the pressure on Khan Yunis and Halhul and Ramallah and Jenin and some other places. Because while we're here, Jebel Abu Ghanim is becoming Har Homa. And this is the key to slow down the process. This is the one story that will reach Americans. I'm sorry, don't offer me a soapbox again, I'll be good.
I think that's extremely helpful, and I wanted to just add one thing, and then we'll get to those two questions and others. But I think it's very significant to hear another statement that George Ball had made in his book. This is extremely relevant to what you were just saying. The ultimate lesson of the Liberty attack had far more effect on policy in Israel than in America. Israel's leaders concluded that nothing they might do would offend the Americans to the point of reprisal. If America's leaders did not have the courage to punish Israel for the blatant murder of American citizens, it seemed clear that their American friends would let them get away with almost anything. So if at this late date something is done, that will send a very different message. Should I call on them?
I'll help.
Okay, well, I believe this man and then...
Okay. I have two questions. One of them is, have the LBJ tapes that have recently been declassified and we've been hearing on C-SPAN, have they released any kind of information as to conversations President Johnson had at the time of the attack of the Liberty? And the second question is, have you gotten any congressional support? Are there any members of Congress who have openly supported the call for hearings? And do you think that the defeat of Congresswoman McKinney and Congressman Hilliard, because of their stances, will impede this process of getting hearings on the Liberty?
What would you like to answer? Maybe it's better if you stand by that.
What was your first question?
LBJ?
Oh, yes, that's a very interesting question. LBJ had a series of audio tapes that he gave to his secretary. I can't remember her name, but with orders not to release them until 50 years after his death. Well, she was very loyal to LBJ, but a few years ago, she got pretty ill, so she gave them to the LBJ library in Austin. And there's a Dr. Wilson, who's the archivist and historian there. And there's an interesting guy named Don Darling, who has gotten our film on community access television in Austin 3 times now.
So do these tapes?
And they exist, but here's the problem. They've got a very slow mechanism of hearing them. And they're only up to like 64, 65. And we're trying to get this Dr. Wilson to allow us to play a game of leapfrog, and just on starting perhaps May 20th till about the 12th of June. And their audio tapes, there might be 4 or 5 of them, and this should be public knowledge anyway. I'm sorry, what was your second question?
About congressional support, there are any members who are openly calling for hearings?
Well, it's going to be even more difficult after the lessons of Hilliard in Alabama and McKinney in Georgia. McKinney's race was very close, and there were other factors. The thing about the McKinney election that most disturbs me is that there is an article in the Atlanta Constitution, reprinted in the Washington Post, absolutely scalding McKinney for accepting donations from American Arabs and American Muslims. My gosh, imagine. They may have an ancestor that lived in a town with one of these terrorists, you know.
I think that, just if I could.
Sure, please.
I think this, of course, these 2 defeats of people who were really quite courageous, conscientious Congresspeople is a very large blow. On the other hand, I think that those who believe that they are defending Israel, and in my mind, that's not what they're doing, because the violence, what they are perpetuating is violence that benefits absolutely nobody. There's the old saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So the more enormous this cover-up and this manipulation becomes, the more extreme, I suspect and worry, will be the final backlash against it. So it is in everybody's interest that this end now. It's large enough that it end now and we move forward in a much more civilized and logical and just way.
I personally believe that trying to get Congress to do something about this is a waste of time, considering the slavish relationship between the U.S. Congress and Israel. My question is, to your knowledge, has anyone ever tried or considered the possibility of legal action, a lawsuit? Al-Laqarbi, for example, suing the state of Israel for the damage and suing the U.S. government for being an accomplice in this.
Well, it's very interesting. They had a reunion of the Liberty survivors in Pensacola this year. And something that I'd been interested in for a long time. And everything was right for it, and it clicked. And I have the signature of 37 Liberty veterans that have agreed to sue the government of Israel for the murder of their 34 shipmates. There's no statute on murder, but we're just in the structural stage of this. But I think in time that's going to have a very, very good impact, and it will be for a large figure.
I think it's the only thing to do.
Yes, and they're very angry now, and there's more camaraderie, and we put together a group called the Liberty Alliance, and I've worked very hard to get the most credible and from a military standpoint powerful still living people I could find, and I've been relatively successful. The chairman of our organization is Admiral Thomas Moore, and the vice chairman is General Ray Davis. He's a 4-star Marine general. It's a, excuse me, a lot of rank for the Corps. And that man won the Navy Cross in World War II, the most important medal the Navy bestows. He won the Medal of Honor in Korea and the Distinguished Service Medal in Vietnam. He's known to Marines and the military, and he's the highest ranking Medal of Honor hero. And our treasurer is Admiral Merlin Starring, who was a Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy. All three of them are in our film. And Ambassador Jim Akins, and a good friend of mine, of course I've known Jim for a long time, almost as long as I've known Professor Shirabi. But the other guy is Jack Tiller. Jack's a very interesting guy. He's done over 1,000 films for television. He did all of the Jacques Cousteau series. For 27 years, he did the National Geographic specials. And what makes our film work is Jack Tiller. You know, the smoothness and the music and so on.
The U.S. government would not be a defendant in the suit?
I think it would have to be a defendant in the suit because of the cover-up and the recall. I mean, I'm not a legal expert. I'm trying to get a team together, a very sound, one American lawyer, a very sound international lawyer, and an Israeli lawyer. Because an Israeli lawyer would be easier for them to subpoena things in Israel. But we are moving ahead with that. We've just released the film since of May 14th, and we have just now 5,000 copies out. And some of the letters we've been targeting, and where our reaction from the American Muslim and Arab community has been abysmal, the reactions within the American military has been really quite good. I was in Minnesota on last Saturday. They passed a resolution, and this is a tough group. They're called the Veterans for Peace. One of their main arguments is no war against Iraq. About half a dozen guys with one eye, a lot of them without a hand, leg, mostly Vietnam and Korean. And they let me talk to them, and then they asked me questions for about 2 hours. And then we saw the film on all these screens. And they wouldn't let me in the meeting for the vote on the resolution, but it passed unanimously. And that felt good. And then the D.C. chapter of the American Legion on May 30th passed a resolution that I helped write, so I know how strong it is, demanding the Congress finally investigate the Liberty. I also don't trust the Congress. In the film, we call for a congressional investigation, but what I think is more doable, and certainly would probably have quicker and better results, would be the Navy was taken out in 1967. They were more or less ordered to cover it up, make a whitewash. And the guy who was really responsible for that was Admiral John Sidney McCain Jr., the senator's father, who was the Cinques Navur, which is the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Navy Europe, and in that capacity also controlled the Mediterranean, and therefore responsible for the Liberty. And so let the Navy have another Navy Board of Inquiry. I'd like them to put Admiral Starring on there. And then the President, Judge Advocate General, and then a very bright commander or captain from the Navy. And full cooperation from the NSA. We have to remember that 25 of the 34 dead on Liberty and most of the injured were American military intelligence, mostly NSA, mostly Navy. There were 3 Marines on board, 2 of them were killed, and there was 1 civilian, Hebrew linguist named Alan Blue. So a congressional oversight committee perhaps, but let the Navy do it and let the CIA and the NSA do everything they can to cooperate. This needs to be brought out there because if Americans realize that this was premeditated, why we're pounding the hell out of Afghanistan, want to pound Iraq again, it's an opportunity finally. I've had a couple of Liberty guys say, you know, the most frustrating thing was when they pounded us for 2 hours and 12 minutes and we had no way to fight back. Every time I put a film in the mail, I'm fighting back and it feels good, you know. We're fighting back with information. And I think in time this story is going to cost a lot of American support for Israel. And one would hope then that our policies in the Middle East would conform much more to our principles.
A minor question. In your investigation, did you find out any of the details of what happened to George Ball following the publication of his book?
Well, I'm probably not the best one to answer that. Maybe Mr. Byrd could answer that.
I would think so.
Yeah,
Mr. Byrd was in the State Department, I believe, for 25 years.
Yes.
And is the director of the Council for National Interest.
Paul Finley's organization. George Ball essentially left office. He would have been Secretary of State except for his attitude on not just the Liberty, but his general attitude toward the strategic relationship with Israel that was just starting to develop. So you can call him another casualty.
Expensive casualty.
Yes.
Well, good, we've answered everybody's question. Pretty good 1-2 team, young lady.
I guess one thing I would just like to leave everyone with is that there are a number of approaches, and of course Congress, in a sense, is top down. They think they're top, but at the same time as this attempt is being made, these films and this information is leaking out. You can't put it back in the box. And I have been going around speaking at Rotary clubs and occasionally at church on many campuses. And people are learning information that is getting to them. They're passing it on. There are new websites, it seems to me, every day that are giving this information out. So that's sort of the bottom up too. And I think that is growing. And that in the end, of course, is what drives Congress. So in the end, congressional leaders, we know, are not leaders. They're followers of what their constituents will vote for or against. And at some point, they will start following these increasing numbers of constituents who will be telling them not to vote the way they have been voting.
Really the only way.
Tremendous vegetation.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. I had more time to do it better, but I'm glad.
You can't.
And that there's a film about it.